Welcome to the fourth in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Peggy Wargelin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress. Today we welcome Beej, constitutional lawyer and small business owner. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here in Concord.
Thanks for having me, Peggy.
All right, most of the questions will be about your knowledge and philosophy of government, as well as your strategies for making decisions. We'll end with a lightning round asking you to quickly comment about other issues important to our members. Let's start with a 2-minute biography. What would you like voters to know about you?
Well, thank you first of all for having me. I am a constitutional lawyer by training. After law school, I practiced for the federal court in Maryland for the chief judge, wrote opinions on constitutional issues, civil rights, the environment, and got a really good sense of the role of government and both its power and its limitations. For the better part of the last decade, I have been a small business owner here in the district. We have 75 employees in the district. One of the things that probably defines me is how we treat our employees. In 2016, after a flood that shut us down for 6 months, I retained my employees, paid their health care, didn't lay a single person off even though I had not a penny coming in, and I took a federal tax lien against myself to do that. So when I ask voters for their support, I ask them to look at the entire body of the work that I've done, both in this district and just overall. And I think that's when people reflect on the choice, and it's an important one, to find their next representative, I hope they'll look at those factors as well and look at not only my resume, but my heart and soul and what I've done in my past. Hopefully that's a little bit of a bio, but I'm sure we'll get into more of it in the grueling questions that.
Sure. That's not bad. All right, so the first group of questions asks about your opinions about the federal government. What types of programs should the federal government be responsible for?
It's a great question. Fundamentally, the federal government, in its creation hundreds of years ago, was designed to do what the states individually couldn't do, or what the states fundamentally couldn't do as well. And I think that's correct. I think the federal government has evolved, obviously. For example, a standing army, which was not necessarily what the founding fathers and framers of the Constitution had envisioned. But the federal government today is there to safeguard the rights of citizens through the 14th Amendment and all of the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court and all of the district and circuit courts. So that's a role that's correct. It's to provide for a common defense through our armed services. Again, a very important role. It's to protect the environment. The states alone are not able, because of both how climate works generally, but also, there are foreign impacts that, from all sorts of activity that happens outside our borders that the federal government can help control. There's monetary policy that the federal government is involved in our common currency. What I'd like to see from the federal government is now an expanded role for health care. And let me explain. I'd like to say that there's no fundamental difference between terrorism and cancer. Yet in one scenario, with terrorism, the federal government is providing for our defense. But against cancer, the federal government says, okay, well, you're on your own. Take care of whatever you need to do, but do it on your own. Let your employer cover you, do that. I think that's a fundamental failure of a role that the federal government can play. If we are invested in our common wealth together, then health is a big part of that. And I think the federal government should play an incredibly expanded role in what I'd like to say eventually is a Medicare for all system, because, you know, we're not much if we're not protecting the weakest amongst us. And I think that's a role the federal government must and should play.
Sure. Thank you. Let's see. Describe one program run by the federal government you feel is especially successful and effective, and explain why you think that is so.
Well, you know, until this current administration, I would have said the EPA. The EPA has done wonders over the last 30 to 40 years in its Superfund program, cleaning up waterways, ensuring that we have clean air, ensuring, you know, again, notwithstanding Flint, Michigan, but you know, that's a program that I think has been incredibly, incredibly strong. I think one of the reasons it was attacked was because it has effectively been a barrier to big corporate polluters, and I think that program, or that department, I should say, needs to be strengthened again and brought back. You know, what saddened me about what's happened under this administration is that fundamentally you took probably the world's smartest aggregation of climate scientists, and you broke it up, or the administration, not you, Peggy. And so, you know, that's really unfortunate. And I think that from the federal government, you know, again, one of its most critical roles, which is to protect where the states can't do it alone, the EPA was one of those areas. And I think that it's a real shame that we've lost not only leadership globally from the stewardship of you know, proper EPA administration. You know, Scott Pruitt was a good example of somebody who was not only unqualified to run the EPA, but exactly an anathema to its mission. And so I think, you know, I'd like to see, and I think in the next Congress, we need to make it more and more difficult for the administration to do things that are opposed to our interests on climate.
Sure. Now describe a federal program you feel is not successful. What improvements would you suggest?
That's a great question, okay? A federal program that's not successful. You know, I would say the Veterans Administration needs additional resources. I won't say it's not successful. The Veterans Administration deals with some of the more challenging medical issues that any body of doctors has to deal with, especially traumatic brain injury and other forms of PTSD. But we haven't given it proper resources such that, you know, the folks that it deals with are veterans, people who have fought with valor for the country, come back to, you know, their home country and wait for treatment, right? And so that, I think, is something that we need to work on significantly. The veterans deserve better. They deserve not only the best care, which, you know, the medical professionals, and I have family members who are part of that corps, the medical professionals there, I think, are very strong. The mission is very strong. But I think we're asking a lot of the VA to work with barriers and structural barriers and impediments to success that we shouldn't, because it's not fair to our veterans.
When is it appropriate to make use of private sector resources like outsourcing and public-private partnerships for government functions?
I'm a traditionalist. I think most government functions should be performed efficiently by government. I think if you look at the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and you look at the current administration's outsourcing of certain functions of transportation infrastructure, you get a good sense of what's wrong with outsourcing. I am on the working group for the North-South Rail Link with Governor Dukakis. I worked on his campaign years ago, so it's been a real honor to sit on that board and hopefully guide it through some really interesting times for that project. But the North-South Rail Link is a good example of something that government must do for its citizens. It is public transport, and public transport means exactly that, that there is no profit motive. But I'll give you another example of where public-private partnership is absolutely wrong. It's in our criminal justice system. In a national basis, if you look at prisons for profit, I think that's unconstitutional. I think the unconstitutionality of it comes from profiting from the infliction of punishment, and I think that is also wrong. So generally, to answer your question, I would say you don't want to see those partnerships. Where you do want to see partnerships is in development. My small business, as you alluded to in the introduction, they're community-based hotels. So we buy hotels that need love, usually very small and boutique. And were once built for grandeur, but over the years have faded. And we bring the community back into those properties, make them sustainable. And in those types of projects, government assistance can help because you're bringing jobs back to a community and you're bringing investment back into the community. So those are areas where public, private partnerships work because they're essentially private functions that need assistance versus public functions that should be handled by private agencies, which I am generally opposed to. And that would help answer, if you aren't going to ask it, my position on charter schools. I fundamentally believe that public education must be public, and it must be public in a way that all of our students are able to participate. Charter schools often take badly needed resources away from that process. Now, if the government were to say, listen, we've fully funded public education and we'd like to provide incentives for private operators or semi-autonomous functionalities of the state that provide additional education, I have no problem with that. Okay. But I think to take public education dollars away is an example of the type of partnerships I think are damaging.
Sure. What federal government programs have you or members of your extended family benefited from?
That's a great question. Probably every single one of them. I've never been a veteran, but the VA's services to our veterans protects me and my family. I worked as an employee for the federal judiciary. So for about a year, I got my salary and health insurance from the federal government and the judicial branch. The State Department gives me an amazing passport that allows me to travel almost anywhere in the world, unfettered, proudly. So that's a program that I've benefited from. My mother has been a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell for 46 years. She's still serving, and she co-founded the sociology department there. The Department of Education does a lot of assistance to state universities. So she's benefiting, as has the state, I think, from her leadership and tutelage of thousands of students now over the 4.5 decades she's been there. My father is a leading civil engineer in the country and has worked with the Army Corps of Engineers extensively, the Department of Transportation, and so I'm going to say that as a big believer in the power and the beauty of the federal government, there have been quite a few more, but I'm not going to bore you with that litany.
Sure. The next set of questions is about how you obtain and use information. What is a fact to you, and how are facts important in your decision making?
Yeah, it's a great question. We live in days of very challenging analysis because the public confidence in what a fact is has been shaken. Public confidence in what news is has been shaken. A fact to me is, I guess definitionally, a truism that is beyond question or reproach. So what does that mean? That means that fundamentally it's something that is true. It is accepted by most of the folks that are looking at that question, and used as a foundational matter in the analysis of whatever the course of action should be. So for me, when I look at, there's an old saying, GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And so we have to get a better sense, hyperbole aside, of what the real challenges are and what the factual premises are of those challenges. I'm saddened. I've loved running for this office. It's given me such pride in being not only an American, but also being someone who's hoping to change the dialogue in Washington. But it saddens me that we cannot agree on what the facts are, because we've become so polarized, and that polarity has allowed us to distance ourselves from a common ground where we do find facts. Commonality are, where we all can agree should be areas like facts. And alas, we can't agree on those. And I think we need to return ourselves to a place where we can agree on facts, that we can, without partisanship, without rancor, without vitriol, come up with a set of facts and then argue about what our path forward might be based on the analysis of those facts. But it does sadden me that we've come to a place that our facts are disputed now.
Sure. Do you verify information provided to you? How do you decide what sources of information to trust?
As a former litigator, verification of facts is what I do. So that's almost a lightning round question for me. Yes. I try to take information from trusted sources, but then even beyond that, look at the sources that offer counterpoints. Again, unless we know what the facts are in a situation and what the reality truly is, we're never going to move to a solution that's better. So, as a litigator, when I wrote opinions for my judge, I spent a lot of time doing citations and legal citations. So the beauty of being a lawyer, especially if you liked, or in my case loved, law school, is that you enjoy finding the core root of a fact or a proposition. So for me, if I'm writing something or saying something, I want to be able to cite it and say, this is where I found this information from, and this is why I believe this to be the case. Because when you're explaining things to people, as judges often do, and judges don't always get things right, but you have to show people the math, the logic behind what you're doing. And I think that's where, my legal training does give me a lot of basis, because I don't just assume. I try to divine from whatever information sources are available that are accurate and reliable, and in some cases not, because sometimes you'll pick up something from an unreliable source. You may not cite it as your foundational information, but it's still relevant to somebody else's analysis, perhaps.
Sure. So how do you communicate with people who trust different information sources than you do?
That's a great question. I've built my life trying to communicate with as broad a swath of people as possible. That means listening, right? Communication is bidirectional, and listening is very important to the true communication. So unlike some of the other candidates running, you'll never hear me railing against even President Trump. I didn't vote for him, and I find his personality and his character abhorrent. There are people who voted for him, and in this district, quite a few of them. And we have to listen to their voices too. Again, the role here is not to be a lecturer or preacher, it's to be a representative. And a representative communicates by listening, hearing what people are saying, and then offering value in response in that communication. So for me, bidirectional communication means that you listen to viewpoints that are not your own. And if you can come to a common understanding, then you've effectively communicated, because then you're actually able to move somewhere. Otherwise, what we like to do in our society today is listen to each other, especially where we agree. And that's great. You feel good for a bit, but then you realize outside that bubble, there's a whole world out there. And I think true dialogue comes from the interlocutory process of, reaching out to other viewpoints. I hope that answers the question.
No, sure, that's great. Let's move on to the specific elected position you're running for. Why do you want to be the U.S. Representative for Massachusetts District 3?
That's a great question. As we enter our last month of this campaign, and all of the negative things about running, one of them is money. We've got to get money out of politics and out of public life in many ways. The corrupting influence of money is a big concern to me. But as I go through that process, I remind myself, why is it that I'm running for this office? First, I think I'm qualified. I've done a lot of things in my life that give me a tool chest, whether it's being a technology innovator in my youth, a constitutional lawyer for years, a lawyer for the hotel industry, for venture capital and private equity for a bit, and now as a small business owner. I think I have relevant experience to help this district move forward. Remember, the diversity of this district is really stunning. I grew up, most of my youth was spent in North Andover, which is slightly outside the district. It borders the district. But I spent years with my dad's company in Lawrence, where at age 14, I designed and implemented an advanced logistics solution for the U.S. Navy. From there, I went to law school, college and then law school. I was a student for a year at UMass Lowell, where my mom taught, and then the love of teaching and academia brought me back to UMass Lowell after law school to teach as an adjunct professor. All of those things have done two things. One, they've given me, I think, in this field, a unique skill set, and also a love for the district, love for places as different as whether it's Andover, where I went to elementary school, or Lawrence, where I've seen the potential of that city, or Lowell, or Fitchburg, or Marlborough, where I worked at Fidelity Investments. I've spent my life in and around this district, I think it has so much potential. I think its people are amazing. I think it can, you know, I think we can lead the country from this district. It is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. It's the birthplace of, in many ways, women's suffrage, of, you know, so many things, the labor movement. All of those things suggest to me that this place has the requisite capability of being really amazing. And I think I'm one of the people that can help get us there, along with so many of our citizens. And I think that's what reminds me why I'm running and why I think I would be a great representative.
Sure. How long have you lived in the district?
So I've lived in the district, you know, for about a year in where I live now. But I've been a corporate citizen of the district for about 5 years. And in many ways, I've lived in the district all my life. But you know, if you wanted to go with legal addresses, North Andover, which is where my parents live still, the house I grew up in, is still in some ways home for me, because you know, when you know, my parents built the house, and I was 4 when it was being built. So you know, home is probably, you know, some combination of where you live today and where you were brought up and have your memories. I was born in Woburn, which is now in the 5th district, but we used to be the 5th district. So you know, the question is, with gerrymandering and redistricting, what is the district? This area I've lived all my life. You know, except for a short stint in Asia when I was heading up Hilton Development in South Asia, I've lived in and around the district all my life.
Okay.
But in my current home, about a year.
Okay. This is a very diverse district. How do you plan to represent the interests of people with such varying concerns and views of what government can and should do?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a very diverse district, and I think the hallmark of my candidacy is that you know, I feel the two-party system is broken. So while I'm a Democrat, I have a lot of friends who are Republicans, a lot of friends who are independents, and a lot of friends who hold very, very different viewpoints than I do. And I think if you ask my friends, especially the conservative friends that I have, whether or not they feel comfortable with me in a leadership role to represent fairly viewpoints other than mine, I think everyone will say that I am an honest steward of ideas, and that, you know, I am open to discussions that lead to something fruitful. So the diversity of this district is, you know, industrial versus rural. It's white versus brown, yellow, and black. It's rich versus poor. It's got everything in this district, and I think, you know, one has to appreciate that diversity and understand it fully. I do. You know, I run a small business that has, as I mentioned before, 75 employees. I see the struggles of my employees. One of the reasons that I think I can represent the working class just as I can represent those who are landed gentry is that you know, I work with people, and I understand their struggles. My business, and sometimes, is paycheck to paycheck. My life is sometimes paycheck to paycheck, even though I don't really take a paycheck. I invest almost everything that I have in my business, so my tax returns are horrific. But someday, perhaps we will have built something. But you know, it's knowing and working with a wide diversity of people, that's my own experience in this district, that gives me comfort with the diversity of the district.
Sure. What concerns do you hear about from voters most often, and what are the issues you're most concerned about personally?
That's a great question. Number one concern, you know, as I started this campaign, I had some senses of what the, the bright line topics would be, but the number one concern that people express to us, to me, is healthcare. That is something we need to really address. It's my top issue, and it's my top issue not just because it is the number one topic that people bring up. It's because that where we are today in finding a solution is so far from where we need to be. And we have a system that's broken. We have a system that my mother the other day was telling me she has a great health insurance program from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the GIC program, which they tried to scale back on recently and failed, luckily. Her prescription for Advair has a copay of $160. And that disc allows her to breathe, right? So think about that. Now, she is a 46-year veteran of the university, and as such, makes a comfortable living. But imagine those who don't. $160 is a big part of someone's paycheck. And so health care is something that we need to solve, because it's not just a human issue, it's an economic issue, it's a moral issue. It's no surprise that I think people are very concerned. But people are concerned about a variety of other things as well. Climate change is big. It's happening, it's real, it's here. We need to address it immediately. I speak Bengali in addition to English. That's the part of India that my parents come from. Bangladesh, which is predominantly Bengali speaking, has 300 plus million people. 100 million plus of them will die from flooding in the next 30 years. Right? It's 100 million people, and that's just one area. To speak a language whose people will perish because climate change, no fault of their own, and have nowhere to go, is morally devastating. And just think about our own country, places in Alaska that are losing yards every couple of months to erosion from rising tide of in Boston. If you look at some of the king tides we got last year, incredibly high tides that will devastate low-lying areas long-term. So I think climate change is a big part of it. And then lastly, I would say, broadly speaking, economic issues. People are really concerned about what they're going to do in the next 20 to 30 years. What will the economy look like 20, 30 years from now? And one of the reasons I am against NAFTA is because I believe that it has net hurt us to have trade agreements that are not bilateral but are multilateral. Multilateral trade agreements are like multivariate analysis in math. It's always easier to solve for one variable than to put in 4 variables. Because you put in 4 variables, and this is from people much smarter than me, the solution is much harder to find. And so I don't believe that trade should be restricted, meaning I don't think you should not be able to sell anyone anything or invest in other countries or have investments from other countries. But we need to monitor those and make sure they're balanced. Because fundamentally, as I once learned, when we were trading for spices and bananas, things that we didn't make here, it didn't matter how much we traded and bought. But when you're trading for things that you could otherwise make here, like at a sneaker factory in Haverhill, or a computer factory in Lawrence or Fitchburg, then if you're trading too much and buying too much from abroad, you become a consumer economy and not an economy that is producing those goods. And fundamentally, those jobs don't come back. And so, I'll give you a long answer to issues.
Yep. Please tell us about how you are financing your campaign.
It's a great question. Unlike the top two fundraisers, I don't have big political friends and donors. Actually, the establishment candidates in this have either gone to, in one instance, gone to big developers in Boston and said, hey, my boss controls your permits, and here's what I'm running for. That's a nice gig if you can get it, and he has raised a lot of money that way. That's, in my opinion, what's wrong in politics. I think we should have public financing of most of these things, and allow broadcasters to give free time so it equalizes the air advantage. Have these types of forums where it didn't cost us any money to be on the air with you today, and hopefully it will elucidate viewers as to what my positions are. But that's where we need to go. So what did I do? In the fourth quarter of 2017, which was really my first reporting quarter, I loaned the campaign money to seed it. And basically to say to the world that, listen, I've never run for politics, but I'm going to take my hard-earned money. I'm not wealthy. Again, I own a small business that's very scrappy, but we're making a difference, and I'm proud of it. But I'm not super wealthy. Both my parents were professors. One still is. So I loaned my campaign money, and then we've raised, I think, including the loan, we've raised a little over $600,000, right? That in a congressional campaign, in a system that isn't broken, should be enough money, but it isn't. So we're not going to be fighting this race the way that some of the bigger campaigns are going to. We won't be able to buy endorsements. We won't be able to do the things that big money can do. But a corollary of that is that I don't have to answer to those people. There are several candidates in the race who believe, as I do, that money should not be the determinant in whether or not you get to represent the people of this district. And I think hopefully long term those voices will win, because they're not at the moment. Money buys you the power to amplify your voice. And amplification that comes from money acquired outside the district from big corporate interests isn't necessarily the amplification that democracy should get. And that's what troubles me. I'm seeing it now firsthand. It used to be academic for me, but I'm seeing it now. And I'll stay involved. In Congress, I will work towards meaningful campaign finance reform. What we have gotten in the last 20 years from various administrations, including Congressman Marty Meehan, has not been effective or strong. And I think that's where we really need to do some work, because folks like Bernie Sanders give me hope that we will be able to reclaim democracy. He almost made it to the White House. If it weren't for a broken campaign finance system and a Democratic Party that decided he's not our guy, he may have been our candidate. And I'm not suggesting that I think in that scenario, a system predetermined based on money which way someone should go and vote. And I think that is a danger when you have too much money in politics. I hope that's an answer.
Sure. And then what are your criteria for accepting or declining contributions?
We know almost all of our donors, which is incredible. When we get reports on our contribution summaries, and I send a personal thank you note to every donor. Even a dollar coming in, we'll spend 75 cents to send you a thank you, because it's not the money, it's the involvement, it's the engagement in the process that someone giving you money to run is allowing you to speak on behalf of others who hopefully need that voice. So I know most of my donors. I would be surprised if there was some, there are very few dollars that we don't know where they came from.
Sure.
We don't accept corporate donations or PAC money. We haven't. So I think I may be the only one. There may be, I think Alexandra may also not have taken PAC money. I don't accept money from the fossil fuel industry. I signed that pledge. Very proud of how we've raised our money. And it's not easy raising money. I'll tell you, this has probably been the most difficult thing I've ever done. Calling friends and family and saying, can you write a check for me to do something for this country? It's tough. And but it also has shown me, who truly, I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and sometimes you get a no. And when you get a no, you say, oh, wow, gosh, I thought our friendship was a little stronger than that. So, but it's been an interesting process.
Sure. National politics is increasingly marked by rancor and division, and dealing with this will be a large part of the job. Describe a past situation where you had to work to get something done with a group of people who strongly disagreed with your position.
That's a great question. I'll give you two examples. First example, as I mentioned, I was a law clerk to Judge Benson Everett Legg of the District Court of Maryland. He was appointed by George Bush Sr., and as such was a moderate to conservative Republican judge. He hired two then very liberal law clerks, me being one of them. My co-clerk was Stacy Bogert. And during the time that I clerked for Judge Legg, affirmative action came under attack. And the judge did not believe in affirmative action and believed that the University of California Bakke versus Bakke decision needed to be overturned, and that we were going to do it with University of Maryland versus Farmer, or Farmer versus the University of Maryland was the name of the case. As you can imagine, as a liberal, I was horrified that I was going to have to write an opinion that went against every viewpoint that I held in terms of the role of affirmative action, and especially the role of affirmative action in higher education. I fundamentally believe that higher education can only be deemed higher if it incorporates the viewpoints and voices and minds of all of our population in representative quantities. And at the time, when Bakke was decided, African American voices were underrepresented, Hispanic voices were underrepresented, and affirmative action helped correct that in higher ed. Over the course of the 6 months that we took to decide that case, my judge and I were able to work towards a decision that affirmed Bakke, that affirmed affirmative action, and I'm very proud of that, because it was me convincing him, but him also, it was interplay. It wasn't just me saying, hey, I'm a young lawyer that thinks I know. Right? I was able to work with somebody whose viewpoints were very different than mine. I think that's important. It's very important. I'll give you another. I'll give you another case. In Boston, through community action, where I lived in Charlestown for a couple of years when I was a lawyer in downtown. They wanted to put a Homeland Security detention center right on Main Street. I worked with the community to gather viewpoints such that we convinced the developer that wasn't the right place to do it. There was no lawsuit filed. It was cooperative between the community action. I was the spokesperson for the group that did it. Got a lot of press about it. I was on Fox News as the brown kid that was fighting Homeland Security. But, you know, we were able to effectively change policy, and the GSA, ended up changing its decision and moving that center elsewhere. So,
Sure.
maybe 2 examples.
All right. What is your philosophy on legislative compromise?
Look, I think legislative compromise is what legislation is. The process of coming to a correct piece of legislation is listening to voices that are coming from all over, right? So think about our federal system for a second. Our federal system was designed so that states like Massachusetts and Mississippi did not have to do the same thing. They weren't supposed to be identical. They were supposed to have a common thread that ran through them, and certain things that the federal Constitution provides for, but also things that, as we discussed, the federal government provides for. Legislation on things such as education and health care affect people in those disparate places. And I think the compromise that we must be willing to make has to accommodate for the differences that the federal system allows states to have. Again, we weren't designed such that we were supposed to be identical throughout the land. It's that certain guarantees of fundamental rights should be protected, and legislation on the distribution of funds, highway dollars, education dollars, environmental dollars, that's where we have to come and balance between the viewpoints that very rightfully under a federal system could be different. And it gets thorny when you start talking about things like Planned Parenthood, right? And the funding of Planned Parenthood. I once volunteered for the Planned Parenthood facility in Brookline that was attacked years later, and am a believer fundamentally in the right, a woman's right to choose what she does with her own body. I think that is, Roe v. Wade and Casey both need to be affirmed. One of the reasons I'm very, very, very concerned about where our Supreme Court is headed. But compromise is important in effective legislation and the legislative process. And I think I've shown in my career the ability to hear a lot of different viewpoints and then work towards compromise.
Thank you. All right, finally, let's touch quickly on some other issues important to our members. Please give a quick response to each below. You may have covered some before.
Okay.
That's okay. A woman's right to choose.
Yes.
Health care.
Universal health care through eventually Medicare for all is what I would want to see.
Okay. Civil rights.
I've written opinions on civil rights. I don't think there is a stronger defender of civil rights for minorities of all kinds, but also the majority. Civil rights for all is something that I've worked my entire life, including in the judiciary, to support and defend.
Net neutrality.
Yeah. Yes. I support Senator Markey's work in this area, but I would also say that we are in danger of corporations controlling our mind. And so not only is net neutrality the right area for us to push on, but we need to expand the ability of independent thought and the independent viewpoints to be expressed just as powerfully as those supported by big corporate interests.
Sure. Gun regulations.
That's a thorny one in that we talked about legislative compromise, right? I am a big defender of Massachusetts-style regulations on gun sales. I would go even further than Massachusetts goes in the control and taxation and monitoring of ammunition sales. I think the ATF already has jurisdiction in ammunition sales. I'll give you an example, and I know this is a violation of your lightning round.
It's okay.
But if you go to the bank and you take $10,000 of cash or more, they're going to write down your Social Security number, not to prevent you from doing it, but to actually have an opportunity to track where cash goes. And it's basically to protect against money laundering. If that's what we do for cash, $10,000 bills, why don't we do it for 10,000 rounds of ammunition? Take the same type of control. Let's say for our Second Amendment, you know, those in the red states that absolutely won't take any regulation, I bet they can agree that writing down somebody's name and information that buys thousands and thousands of rounds of ammunition, just so you can monitor. Are they also posting hate speech? Are they also doing things that we might not otherwise support as a free society? Maybe we can draw those conclusions before people die. And so I would go further. I think it's guns are an anathema to a civil society, and we need to try to reduce their presence whenever we can.
Sure. The latest round of tax cuts.
That's unfortunate. We have so many other priorities in this country, and to give corporations and pass-through entities billions of dollars of tax breaks is it's unjust.
Government policy for the situation in Puerto Rico.
Well, you know, we have a president who has shown that he, you know, fundamentally has issues with folks who don't look like him, right? So that's the best way I can say it without calling him a racist. You know, I think fundamentally when you have people like that in power, you're going to make decisions that look like his world viewpoint, right? We had Americans dying, thousands of them now, most likely, and he was touting the ratings of his landing in the country and tossing paper towels to, you know. So fundamentally, government policy there has been unjust. It's been really shameful that we've not taken care of our fellow Americans because of the color of their skin.
Immigration policy.
Immigration policy, you know, obviously what's happened in the latest round of separating families is unconscionable. It's not befitting a great nation to use scare tactics to deter immigration, lawful or not. We don't shoot people at the borders because that would surely deter people, right? But we don't shoot them without process because we're not that country. Well, doing something that's not quite that bad just to deter conduct is not what Americans do. It's un-American. But broadly speaking, immigration policy in this country is flawed. We need more immigrants, not less. Immigration has been the source of national growth in our economy, in our mind space, in the ideas that represent America. Many of them have come from immigrants, and that I think is why we need to really focus on increasing legal immigration, increasing opportunities for students to come and study in our great institutions of higher learning. That will help finance our education system. And it will allow Americans to get more access to education because there are plenty of folks abroad who have money who can spend it in our institutions. Germany is following this model now, and they're increasing because we are decreasing the flow of people into the country, and places like France and Germany are saying, wow, that's a real opportunity for us to steal some talent and grow. You know, look, China has a deep advantage. India has a deep advantage in that there will be a lot of people and labor available. The United States has seen a steady decline on the base of, you know, population growth is slowing, and that I think long-term may hurt us. We have a lot of land here. We have a lot of places we can develop, a lot of places that we can do more with more people. And I think getting the world's best and brightest through better immigration policy is a part of it.
Okay. And finally, campaign finance reform.
Yeah, I think I've touched on it already, but I would say this. Congressional campaigns, especially in the 3rd District of Massachusetts, should not see a campaign raise $3 or $4 million. It's just not necessary. It really hurts our democracy when we are requiring people to raise that kind of money. And here's why. If you have someone raising that kind of money to run a campaign, it drowns out free speech. Free speech is not just about being able to afford free speech. It's the ability to be able to speak and be heard. And money is a major problem. That Citizens United, etc. So we need to work on that in a real and meaningful way to return ourselves to a place that we can be a democracy.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been great.
Thank you for having me. It's really been
Sure.
enjoyable.
Thank you. So this has been an interview with Beej Das, candidate for Representative Niki Tsongas' U.S. House of Representatives seat. I'm Peggy Wargelin for Concord Citizens Protecting Progress.